The epic faceplant, how GM went from king to questionable. What's up, gearheads? Ever watched someone with $1 billion set it on fire while insisting they're just making s'mores? That's basically General Motors' business strategy for the last few decades. I'm Bill, and today we're dissecting the magnificent train wreck that is GM's downfall. Because nothing says automotive entertainment like watching a giant repeatedly stub its corporate toe while blaming the coffee table. Before we dive into this beautiful disaster, smash that subscribe button harder than GM smashed their market share. And buckle up. This ride has fewer safety features than a 1970s Chevette. GM, once the untouchable titan that had Americans believing apple pie, came standard with every Chevrolet. In 1955, they controlled an absolutely ridiculous 50% of the U.S. auto market. That's not a typo, folks. 50%. One company selling half the cars in America. Fast forward to today, they're desperately clinging to about 16%, like it's the last lifeboat off the Titanic. So what happened? How does a company go from, "We are the American auto industry," to, "Please notice us, we made another crossover SUV"? Let's break down the 10 spectacular faceplants that turned GM from American icon to cautionary business school case study. Fact 1. Ignoring foreign competition. In the 1970s, when Japanese automakers started bringing reliable, fuel-efficient cars to America, GM's response was basically, "Phut, whatever. Americans will always buy American." They would not, in fact, always buy American. While Honda and Toyota were creating cars that, I don't know, actually started in cold weather, GM was busy convincing itself that cup holders were revolutionary technology. Speaking of revolutionary thinking, if you thought ignoring competition was smart, wait until you see how GM handled innovation. It's like watching someone bring a spoon to a gunfight while insisting the spoon is actually cutting-edge technology. Fact 2. Innovation constipation. For decades, GM treated innovation like that weird food in your fridge you're afraid to throw out, but definitely won't eat. Toyota introduced the Prius in 1997. GM's electric response? The EV1, which they promptly crushed. Literally. They took working electric cars and sent them to the compactor. That's like inventing the iPhone and then saying, "Nah, people probably want more flip phones. Let's burn our prototypes." But hey, at least they were consistent in their questionable decision-making. GM's management strategy makes Game of Thrones look like a masterclass in stability and wise leadership. Let's watch this organizational chart turn into abstract art. Fact 3. Management chaos. GM's organizational structure was so complex that decisions moved through it at roughly the same speed as continental drift. By the time a new idea got approved, your grandkids would be old enough to drive. At one point, GM had more layers of management than a wedding cake in July. And about as stable, too. They were so busy having meetings about meetings that they forgot to notice customers were fleeing to competitors who could, make decisions occasionally. Speaking of forgetting things, if memory serves, wasn't there something called quality that customers supposedly care about? GM certainly seemed to treat that concept like a distant rumor. Fact 4. Quality? Never heard of her. While Japanese automakers were obsessing over eliminating defects, GM was apparently striving to make them collector's items. If your Chevrolet doesn't have at least 3 unexplained rattles, did you even buy a GM product? The 1980s GM lineup had more plastic than a Beverly Hills surgeon's waiting room, and about the same commitment to long-term durability. They weren't building cars, they were building ticking time bombs with cup holders. But perhaps GM's most impressive skill was their uncanny ability to completely misunderstand what consumers wanted. It's like they surveyed drivers from another dimension. Fact 5. Tone-deaf product planning. Gas prices skyrocketing? Perfect time to double down on Hummers and Escalades. Electric cars gaining popularity? Let's make another Tahoe. GM consistently zigged when the market zagged, creating a product lineup that matched consumer demand about as well as snowshoes match a beach vacation. They built cars for the America that existed in 1965, not the one that was actually buying cars. Of course, all this brilliant strategy required some creative accounting to keep the lights on. Let's talk about how GM played financial Jenga with their balance sheet until gravity inevitably showed up. Fact 6. Financial mismanagement. GM treated their finances like a teenager with their first credit card at a mall. Their pension obligations alone were the size of some countries' GDP. By the early 2000s, GM was spending millions. Fact 6. Financial mismanagement. GM treated their finances like a teenager with their first credit card at a mall. Their pension obligations alone were the size of some countries' GDP. By the early 2000s, GM was spending more on healthcare than they were on steel. Let that sink in. They were essentially a health insurance company that occasionally remembered to make cars. But the real masterpiece in GM's gallery of terrible decisions? Their brand strategy, which can only be described as buy all the brands, then neglect them equally. Fact 7. Brand bloat. At its peak, GM had 8 car brands. 8! Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, Cadillac, GMC, Saturn, and Hummer. That's not a car company, that's a small country. And what was the difference between them? Well, sometimes they had different badges. Sometimes one had more cup holders. Truly revolutionary stuff. They cannibalized their own sales so efficiently that they should have received an award for corporate self-sabotage. If those brands were GM's children, their union relationships were that awkward marriage that everyone knew was dysfunctional, but stayed together for the kids. Fact 8. Labor relations nightmares. While Toyota and Honda were building flexible, efficient factories in the U.S. with cooperative workforces, GM and the UAW were locked in what can only be described as a decades-long passive-aggressive Thanksgiving dinner argument. The result? Labor costs that made other automakers look at GM the way you look at someone who pays full price for airline tickets. But perhaps GM's most artistic failure was their talent for making boring cars sexier than a filing cabinet convention. Fact 9. The Beige Parade. For years, GM's design philosophy appeared to be, what if we made cars that perfectly match the color of oatmeal, both visually and emotionally? While competitors were designing cars that made people feel something, anything, GM was perfecting the art of automotive amnesia. You could park a 1990s Lumina in your driveway and forget it existed before you reached your front door. And finally, when all these brilliant strategies inevitably led to disaster, GM perfected the last piece of their downfall puzzle, the art of the corporate bailout. Fact 10. The $50 billion faceplant. In 2009, after decades of the aforementioned brilliance, GM filed for bankruptcy and received a $50 billion government bailout. That's right, the company that once represented American capitalism needed America to save it from itself. It's like watching Superman need rescue from a paper cut. Conclusion. So there you have it, GM's journey from controlling half the U.S. auto market to corporate welfare recipient in just a few decades. A masterclass in how not to run an auto company. The question now is whether new GM has learned anything from old GM's spectacular mistakes. Their recent pivot to electric vehicles suggests maybe, just maybe, they've finally started paying attention to the road ahead, instead of staring lovingly in the rearview mirror. Call to action. What do you think? Can GM turn things around? Or are they just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic? Drop your hottest takes in the comments below. And if you enjoyed watching me dissect this corporate car crash, smash that like button, subscribe for more automotive reality checks, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss my next video. How Ford survived while their American cousins face-planted. Until next time, keep your engines running better than GM's business plans. Later, gearheads.